Alright, let's get excited about film. I know this is a digital world, but I'm passionate about film photography, and I hope in the next 20 minutes or so you will be too. It's pretty clever, right? I don't know, maybe it is. This was my first camera. It was a film camera. It was a 110 film. You really can't get it anymore, but it was a plastic crappy camera that took crappy pictures, and I'm still taking crappy pictures, but I loved it because it was an experience. Loading it, taking it to the store, and waiting a couple of days. There was just a sense of wonder and excitement about film, and I still enjoy that today. One of the things that makes photography different than some of the other plastic arts like painting and architecture and sculpture, aside from some of the more abstract or more avant-garde types, is that photography is very serendipitous. There's a lot of chance. The light changes, your subject blinks, something happens you didn't expect it to. You're capturing a moment that you don't control everything that happens. There's always surprises when you get film back. Or even in digital, there's always surprises on what you caught that you might not have gotten. You might have gotten to that decisive moment. But this chanciness, I made up that word, this chanciness, this randomness, the noise in photography is part of what makes it so charming and so different. And I really believe that. And when you look at this widely known quote from the greatest photographer of all time, not me, sharpness really is a bourgeois concept. And in a digital world where armchair photographers are comparing the optimal resolution of a sensor and this lens versus that lens, the whole idea of having a compelling image that says something to the viewer emotionally, even if it's a simple statement, has kind of gotten lost. And the cult of sharpness, so to speak, has kind of lost sight of what makes something interesting. And so we throw out convention a lot of times when we're shooting with film, so we can just kind of bring photography down to its most raw elements, pointing the camera at something interesting and knowing when to click the shutter. And that's part of the beauty of using film. So there are good things about digital. It's very predictable, it's very controllable, it's easy to get good resolution and sharpness. You don't have to know what you're doing to get a good sharp image out of even the crappiest digital cameras at this point. At this point, we could also shoot at 6400 ISO all day long. You just push that ISO up, so you can still shoot your f5.6 125th. No problem. Everything is automated for you at this point. I mean, the camera will decide what to focus on and whether it's moving, and it'll keep it focused on that, and it'll tell you what your shutter speed and aperture, and it'll set it for you. And then it'll process a JPEG and deliver to you a fully finished image that's ready for printing on your digital printer. It's ultimately a process of ones and zeros that's controlled to a large part by machines. This is exactly why digital is bad. Sure, professional photographers love digital. Their job is getting predictable results. But that's not fun. That's not what makes photography interesting. Predictable and controllable is not what excites me about photography. It's that serendipity, that not quite knowing, and having your hands on it, so to speak, is what makes it exciting. The other thing is that sharpness and resolution are not the only qualities that make an image look good to the viewer. We'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing is that there's a lot of things about film that hold you back. You can't shoot film at 12,000 plus ISO. You just can't. So you start to make compromises, or you start to make choices, and it forces you to think a little bit differently about your creative options when you're shooting. You can really get to a very simple process with film that makes you think entirely about the image and how to do it. The fact that you have so much automation available to you is a distraction, even if you don't use it. And John Connor would tell you a process of ones and zeros controlled by machines, it just doesn't sound all that exciting and interesting to me. So there's a couple reasons why film rocks. I'm going to give you a little bit of biology. And I know it sounds boring, but this is absolutely true, and I believe that there is a part of our evolutionary biology that makes us like images printed from film better. Analog processes are hardwired into our bodies. For example, CDs. On paper, in every way, CDs are better than records. But you still have high-end audiophiles buying record players for $50,000, which is essentially a sound wave etched into a piece of plastic and scratched out by a needle and amplified. But this is the way we hear. We hear sound waves created in the real world that bounce around and hit things and get muddied and dirtied, and they go through the air and they change. There's a lot of harmonics and noise in the way that we hear the world. And record players kind of replicate that, and we react emotionally to it much differently than clean, clinical, digital music. Most recording artists will actually apply warming filters or run a sound through a analog tube preamplifier or compressor just to get it that analog warmth to it. Well, images have warmth too. And images on film kind of have this analog noise. And we'll look at digital noise versus film noise. But it's basic that the noise in the system has just kind of something pleasing and interesting to it that's hardwired in us. And it's hard to get away from that fact. And there's so many quote-unquote film filters for digital images because digital images just are too clean, clinical, and boring for us to look at. The other thing is film is hands-on. It's a manual process. You have to do things with your hands that you don't do with digital. And being connected to our world has a psychological and emotional difference. So the process of shooting film is incredibly rewarding. It feels good. Now, again, if you just care about delivering a good file that's super clean and easy to make, no, this is not good for you. But if you just love photography, the process of using film is just so fulfilling and rewarding and ultimately time-consuming. The other thing is soft roll-off versus clipping. Of course, it smells good, but I'm going to show you what this looks like in a little bit. But what the soft roll-off means is that as you approach completely white, rather than just going, okay, 2 levels away from white, 1 level away from white, white, in a linear fashion, what happens is the tones kind of get compressed as you get brighter and brighter and brighter, and you're actually able to get a nice, even tonal transition to completely white, where digital just goes getting close, boom, white, and it just cuts off right there, and it looks awful. And so if you look digital versus analog, it's kind of like if you've ever seen a beautiful guitar with flamed maple. It just has such dimension. It's almost three-dimensional when you look at it, and depending on which angle the light is hitting the wood, you get a different sheen and patina. You just can't get this from a fake wood grain painted on Pergo or something like that. It's just impossible. The richness and the depth of quality of analog, natural things, kind of like film, is impossible to replicate. The noise in the system is kind of a testament to this. This is what digital noise looks like. It's hideous. It looks awful. I mean, it really does. It's impossible to look at, and you apply these denoise filters to try to get rid of it because it looks so bad. It's just because you have a pixel that didn't get the color right or didn't get the tone right, and it just looks weird, and then you have software trying to correct it, and by the time you get your image, it's been processed to the hilt. This is just right here, this grain, these are just how the crystals clumped together once when they were hit by the light and developed. It's kind of a random process, and you don't have machines telling them where to go. This is a high grain film, and you can see that there's a lot of grain magnified, pretty close. This is just a very tiny crop from a film image, but you get these nice tonal transitions, and it just looks pleasing and good, even though this is really what you're looking at, noise. Now, of course, there are films out there that give you a lot less noise, and you can barely see the grain in this here. And you have choices with the films that you use. And this is that soft shoulder that we talked about. With digital, as you go from completely black to completely white, you only have so many levels to work with. And as you get towards white, you get this banding, this posterization, this banding here that brings you all the way into white. And you just can't get away from it. So with digital, you're constantly making sure you didn't clip or that you didn't overexpose. Where film, it gives you plenty of room to work with. Sometimes like 5, 6, 7 stops extra, just to allow yourself to let the whites go where they may, so you could focus on getting detail in the shadows. Digital clipping really sucks, but the roll-off getting to complete white with film is really nice. And again, the way that film works is the way our bodies work. The way our bodies work is if something is twice as bright, we don't perceive it as being twice as bright. As things get brighter and brighter and brighter, we actually perceive those transitions as being more and more subtle. And film actually works that same way. It's amazing that the way our eyes and our ears work from a sensory standpoint is exactly the way that film works. Digital does not work that way. It's completely linear. It's just a bucket collecting photons and reporting back about that, and then your software has to put a nice curve back onto it artificially afterwards. So again, digital works more like we do, and it gets you these beautiful results. I mean, this is, you can almost feel the texture of these leaves. They almost look velvety, and this is coming from slide film, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. And you know, you could use filters in digital to try to get this look, or you could just use film. The other thing is that you can actually get a incredibly nice, interesting, high grain look here. Again, the tonal transitions in the shadows, there's no detail here, but the shadows moving away into these highlights, it just looks nice. And it's a look that you can try to replicate using a filter, but at the end of the day, there's something rewarding about getting this nice analog noise. And this is actually Kodak Tri-X, shot at ISO 1200, and with a special processing technique using Kodak D76 developer. Film has dimension. You know, the way a digital sensor works is it's a flat two-dimensional plane that's collecting photons, but there are crystals inside this emulsion which has depth that light is hitting. And so when you actually have your image on the film and you look at it with a grain magnifier, you can actually focus all the way through that emulsion and kind of see different layers of those crystals in there. And that's kind of cool. And if you actually use a darkroom development technique and you're actually doing wet prints, you can get that a beautiful, rich, almost 3D quality to your tones and textures of the image. And this is so hard to do with digital. Again, film has dimension and randomness. You know, you never quite know if one crystal or another is going to get hit by light and turn black when you develop it. There's a certain kind of serendipity to the entire process. I'm not going to tell you exactly how it worked, but I will tell you it's not wizards. So there's a lot of different types of emulsions. Black and white, basically all film is black and white, but color film puts extra filters in there and then later attaches colored dyes to what's ultimately multiple black and white images. So that's kind of the way that color film works. So that's all black and white, but there's standard grain black and whites, which are like Tri-X, HP5 Plus, Neopan, and those are basically, like in the 80s and the 70s, everybody was looking for the finest grain possible. Get rid of the grain. These are the people that invented digital cameras. So they invented T-grain films, which have films that when you look at the grain under a microscope, they look like little T's. And the grain almost disappears, giving you kind of a glassine, pristine kind of look. And when you saw that picture of the girl's eye, you know, the one on top where you could barely perceive the grain, could have been a T-grain emulsion. And then there's chromogenic C41, which basically is a black and white film you can get developed at CVS, and it uses dyes the way that the color film process works, color C41. So you can actually just drop your black and white film off at CVS. It doesn't quite have grain. It's kind of like clouds of dye instead of grain, so it looks very different. Then you have slide film, color positive, which means that the actual image on the film is color true rather than color negative. And you have color negative film, like your Kodak Gold and stuff like that. There's also specialty films that do things like infrared and stuff like that. We're not going to talk about that today. As far as size goes, you can have medium format, which would be 120 film, or your standard 35 millimeter that can be purchased in either cassettes, the way we're used to seeing them in the store, or like I do, a roll of 100 feet. And you actually just use a little device that you get off eBay for 10 bucks to roll your own film. Now, sometimes I only want 12 frames. I don't want an entire roll of 36. And so you can kind of roll your own canisters that have the number of frames that you want, and you get the price down almost by 50% by doing that. You know, film has very different qualities, and you can go online and read about it. But for color film, the way that color is rendered and the character and how it saturates, Velvia 50 is very saturated versus your Portra Nutricolor, which they don't have anymore. But certain color emulsions have different color characteristics than other. It's kind of like they have their own preset tone curve, and you can modify that curve by underexposing or overexposing or changing the development. Grain structure, sharpness, and acuity are three things that are used to describe black and white film. Latitude. Can I over or underexpose without running into problems? What does the curve, the density curve, look like? Can I underexpose by 2 stops and still get really nice shadow detail, or does it disappear? So different films have a different latitude or margin for error. Tri-X from Kodak is kind of famous for having a lot of latitude, where you can just kind of shoot it at f8 1/25 all day long, and you're kind of sure you're going to get images. They might not be perfect, but you're going to get them. Pushability. With different developing techniques, by leaving it in the developer longer or changing the way that you agitate in the developer, you can actually kind of shoot films that might be rated at an ISO 100 or 400. You could shoot them as if they're at higher ISOs and still get a decent image. Sometimes that will change the grain structure. It will change the way that the details are shown in the shadows. A lot of times it will require you to kind of have an increase of contrast, but again, certain films are able to be pushed better than others, and also certain film developer combinations push better than others. And finally, you kind of have the rated ISO, which is kind of like when you look at the sum of your camera and your lens, the film emulsion you're using, your development technique, and the way you're processing your prints. So are you using a condenser enlarger in the darkroom, or are you scanning? That will kind of help you determine what ISO you need to shoot at to get good quality prints, and that's kind of a sum of everything in your process. So, you know, some of my favorites, Kentmere 400 is the cheapy favorite. You can get a roll of like 100 feet for like $21. This is like totally cheap. For crappy color film, the Fujicolor Superia works pretty well. I'd stay away from any 200 rated films. The new Portra 400 from Kodak is a really nice, more muted, not too saturated color film, but it pushes well. It gives you a lot of room for error. It looks beautiful for portraits, and you know, you can definitely do a little bit of hipster work with Portra. It's a little expensive. Velvia 50 is a landscape, highly saturated, almost unnatural color looking slide film. BWCN from Kodak. This is that black and white that you can actually use using a C41 process. Um, T-max 100 and 400 is T-grain. It's very sharp with low grain structure. Delta 100 is also a T-grain emulsion. This one is the 100-foot pack versus the canisters. Tri-X is a kind of really nice, really easy to use standard grain emulsion that matches up really well with the also easy to use D46 developer or HC110. You could do a lot with this. You could push it all the way up to 1600, no problem. So, here are some choices of film. You gotta kind of go on to Flickr and look up each one and get example images to see what other people are doing with it. This is an example of Tri-X. This was taken in Italy. Now you can't really see it here, but if you look, this was very, 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 very dark. And over here was incredibly bright sunlight. And when you enlarge this image, there's texture on the concrete here as well as all the way down in the shadows here. No digital camera without doing HDR can capture detail in that big of a range. And you would have clipped right here and gotten that awful clipping where you have some actual texture and detail in the film right here. This is what T-max looks like. This is the full image and a very small section of it, but you can barely see the grain in this image. Some of this might actually be from the scans, but you can tell with T-max you get so little grain, and you can get a very, very, very sharp and high resolution image. Maybe not quite like a 21 megapixel DSLR sensor at this point, but you could certainly get pretty huge enlargements, as you can see, using T-max. This is T-max 100 pushed, so this is the 100 film pushed to 400, 2 stops, and you see that you still get really nice tonal qualities. There's direct sunlight coming in here, but you still have detail in her hair, as well as it doesn't show so much on digital here, but there's actually some detail here in this corset. So you get in a really nice tonal range with nice contrast, even when you push T-max up to 400. And this is with D76 developer. Delta 3200 has tons of grain. This is practically taken in the dark. It's really a 1600 film that you push to 3200. It's made from Ilford. It's a specialty one. It's got a very distinct look to it. Again, another example. It's really hard, with the presentation shown here on YouTube or someplace like that, it's really hard to tell the difference between what's grain and what's like enlargement noise and stuff. But again, this is what Delta 3200 looks like. This is technical pan. They don't really have this anymore, but it was taken with a Holga crappy lens. But if you look up this photo and you do a tin eye on it, the tonal qualities to this are truly amazing for such a low resolution lens. And this is taken on a decent film that is very high resolution that you really can't get anymore. This is Fuji 160S. It's a highly saturated film, obviously a double exposure, but you can kind of see that film can get you very highly saturated colors that are unique, and it's really hard to get this screwing with the sliders on a digital image. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you do a double multiple exposure, you never know what's going to come out of it. There's kind of a guessing game to what you're going to get, and that's part of the fun of film. Portra 400 is one of the newest film emulsions out here. This is a tiny kind of crop from an image. The colors are just so nice. The rendering and the tonality of these colors are really wonderful. You can push it all the way up to 3200. This is Portra pushed to 3200. Photography did these in Miami. You still get really amazing, nicely saturated colors and a decent resolution. And for film, 3200 is really spectacular, even getting an image. And from a resolution standpoint, there's a tiny little crop from this part of the image, and you're still seeing lots of detail, nice transitions and tone. I mean, really, unless you need to be printing wall-size prints, film can get you all the resolution that you need. You could process things in the store. You can usually tell the store to push to stop. So if you take a 400 film and shoot it at 1600, they can usually do that. If you have a Holga or some kind of crazy pinhole camera, tell them that you used a crazy pinhole or Holga camera, because they might just say, the computer might say, these images are funny, and just not do your prints or develop your film. Depending on whether you shoot Fuji or Kodak, you might want to match the chemistry that the lab that you uses versus the film that you have. And if you're really OCD, you can get a good lab to do a clip test to make sure that they're doing a good job developing. And definitely Wikipedia or Google clip test. When you do your own processing, particularly of black and white, your developer choice is really important. I mean, what developer you use and how you use it is a creative choice, just like what lens should I use, because it will absolutely change the resulting quality of your image. You can cross-process film, meaning taking a slide film and developing it in a negative film chemistry and vice versa, and it will get you a lot of, interesting, hipster, weird to look at effects. That's something that you can do just by having them take slide film and developing it in a regular C41 process. This is an example of a pretty specialized emulsion, Pan F50. It's made by Ilford. It's a very low ISO film. I actually rate mine at 20 ISO. And Rodinal, which is a developer that is a very low grain developer, and you can get really spectacular glassine looks with that. This is something done with the neutral density filter and getting a long exposure and the wispy waterfalls here. It won't show up in digital, but the beautiful thing here is when you do these ultra long exposures, the highlight areas won't blow. You get that nice compression in this area of highlights, so you'll have really nice tonal transitions when you actually look at the negative of something like this. Go to digitaltruth.com and their massive developer chart and see all of the things that you like. I usually use Kodak. D76 is the easiest developer in the world to use. It matches up nicely with things like Tri-X, HP5 Plus, or Kentmere 400. HC110 is a compensating developer that allows you to do some interesting things like stand development, where you let the film sit in there for like an hour in a very low concentration developer to help bring the shadows out of images that you try to push the film. T-Max developer is actually specifically made for T-grain films, but you don't have to develop T-grain films in a T-Max developer. There's a lot of things that you can do. You could go to like your local photo shop and they'll give you a photo CD, which gives you crappy low resolution scans of your film. North Coast Photo, this is kind of what Ken Rockwell uses, but they're pretty reasonable for like, 12 bucks, maybe 13 bucks. They'll develop your film and then do a pretty high resolution scan on a decent machine right along with it. It takes them about 2 weeks and they turn it around. And then there's Scan Cafe, which you can send a whole bunch of prints to. And then, 200-300, and a couple weeks later you get, modestly good scans. The people that they have know what they're doing, but they use kind of like lower end scanners to do their stuff. So you can send it out. You can actually do a drum scanner rental, which are these amazing high quality scanners that will get every ounce of information from your negative, but you're going to pay a ton of money. Or you can get a flatbed scanner, dedicated scanner. Ultimately, if you want to do this, really do a dedicated film scanner or learn how to scan using a DSLR and a macro lens or a bellows. But ultimately, this is a dark art that's really hard to figure out. So figure out how the hell am I going to scan these things before you really start going digital, start going film like crazy, because you'll end up having a ton of rolls of film laying around that you're not sure you want to develop and you don't know what to do with afterwards. Here's an example of why film is so great. This was taken in the Javits Center with medium format Bronica. And if I took this with digital, like, first of all, you can actually see the details in these dark shadows, and it's really bright outside. And when you look up front, you can see the individual windows and even some of the details in there right here in this tiny little crop. I mean, you're really looking at the equivalent of a 50 megapixel image that you get in really good detail, plus areas that would be completely blown out in any digital image. You're getting really nice tone transitions. This is what you're getting by using film. This is actually a Holga image, if you'll believe that. Film allows you to focus on the image, to not worry about the settings and all that stuff, and just kind of do it and worry about the processing later. When you have a digital camera, there's just so many darn things to think about, and if you're really focused and disciplined, and you say, well, I won't use those features, they're still there, they're still present. And it's just, if you want to simplify your life, you can go as simple as getting a crappy Holga camera, or even just using a Leica, where you just have like one thing or two things to think about at a time, which is really nice. There's a lot of different ways to shoot with film. Film does provide you with choices. You get to choose your emulsion, you get to choose what ISO you want to shoot it at. When you shoot film, your focus is on getting as much detail as you need in the shadows, not worrying about the highlights. It's a totally different way of thinking. With digital, it's like, don't blow the highlights, don't blow the highlights, let the shadows deal with themselves. For film, it's don't block the shadows, let the highlights take care of themselves. It's completely opposite. So when it comes to exposure, your view changes to, where do I want my shadow detail to be in this image? And those are the kind of exposure decisions that you're generally making. The great thing is, you get a new sensor with every roll. You go to your color sensor, you go to your high grain sensor, you go to your low light sensor. Every roll and every frame, essentially, you have a new sensor. And then you can process these things differently to get different effects. It's a manual process, and you're going to screw up a lot of the time. You're never quite sure what you're going to get, and that's part of the fun with it. Compensating for varied lighting can be tough, especially with color film, with color temperature. If you're taking images under sodium vapor lamps with daylight balanced color film, it's going to look weird. So you really have to have strategies and generally filters, unless you're just going with the who cares, let me just see what happens approach, which is fine. At the end of the day, you still get plenty of creativity after the click, but it's just more fun to work in a dark room or in your bathroom sink, and it's just more fun to do it that way than Photoshop for some people. I hate looking at computer screens. I do it all day. I'd rather do something with my hands in the evening than be on the computer yet again. It's just, it's a way of looking at the world that I think film helps you get out of that rut. So that's it. 35 minutes on film. I know it was a lot of information, and some of it might not have been all that helpful, but at the end of the day, film is so interesting. It's so exciting. It looks good. It's fun to use. It's got unique qualities. Maybe it's not as sharp. Maybe technically it doesn't make things as easy as digital does, but it certainly has differences that can be appreciated and leveraged to make great photography and make you focus on the image and have a good time while doing it. So I urge you to give it a go, have fun, and enjoy shooting film. Happy shooting. Take care now.